December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. The forest lay buried beneath a silence, so thick it seemed to muffle even the thought of war. Snow had been falling for 2 days straight, turning the pines into white pillars beneath a leaden sky. In the valleys below, the roads wound through villages half abandoned, their rooftops sagging under the weight of winter. The wind carried no sound but its own. Yet beneath that stillness, the storm of battle was gathering. The 101st Airborne Division had been pulled from rest at Mormelon in France only days before, their respite cut short by a message that seemed almost unbelievable. German forces, thought broken, retreating, had launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes. Reports were confused, scattered, and often contradictory. Columns of armor had struck through the mist, cutting deep into Allied lines. Communications faltered. Entire units disappeared. What was supposed to be a quiet sector had erupted into the largest offensive Germany would launch in the West. Now, the 101st was being rushed north by truck, their destination a small, unfamiliar Belgian town, Bastogne. The men rode in open trucks, huddled together beneath blankets and parachutes, the freezing wind cutting through their uniforms. They had no winter clothing, no heavy boots, no artillery support to match the enemy's. Their rations were limited, their fuel low, yet they were told to hold the town at all costs. By the time they arrived, the roads were already choked with retreating columns. Engineers, supply units, scattered infantry. Confusion reigned. German panzers had already punched through to the west and north, threatening to encircle the entire area. Bastogne, sitting at the crossroads of 7 vital roads, had suddenly become the key to the entire front. Whoever held it would control the movement of men and material through the Ardennes. The paratroopers dismounted from their trucks into snow that reached their knees. The air was sharp, metallic, filled with the smell of exhaust and cold iron. Officers barked orders in the half-light, maps flapping in the wind. Fox Company dug in on the northern approaches. Easy and Dog companies spread along the woods to the east. Tanks from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division rolled past, their engines rumbling low, tracks biting into the frozen ground. Civilians watched from doorways, faces pale with fear and disbelief. By nightfall, the snow had turned into sleet. The men of the 101st began to dig. The ground was frozen solid, their shovels sparking against the hard earth. They used helmets, bayonets, even entrenching tools to carve out foxholes barely deep enough to lie in. The sound of artillery rolled in the distance, not yet close, but constant, like a storm approaching across an open plain. The line was forming, thin and imperfect, stretching from Noville in the north to Marvy in the south, a ragged crescent of defense against the unknown. At division headquarters, established in a cold stone building near the town square, General Anthony McAuliffe studied a map illuminated by a single lamp. Red arrows converged on Bastogne from 3 directions. Reports indicated that the German 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army were advancing fast, with at least 2 armored divisions, the 2nd Panzer and Panzerlehr, already on the move. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and half frozen. Yet McAuliffe's orders were clear. Bastogne must not fall. The night deepened. Snowflakes drifted silently through the beams of truck headlights as medics unloaded crates of bandages and morphine. The smell of diesel hung heavy in the air. A column of Sherman tanks clanked into position along the southern edge of town, their crews bundled in scarves and blankets. Their engines idled, producing small clouds of steam that rose into the dark like breath from a sleeping giant. At dawn, the first German shells fell. They landed east of the town, short of the American lines, throwing up fountains of earth and snow. The sound was hollow and heavy, the kind that made the air tremble. The men in the foxholes braced themselves, gripping rifles slick with frost. Within minutes, more rounds came in, walking closer with every burst. Trees splintered, sending shards of wood spinning through the air. Somewhere in the distance, a truck exploded, the echo bouncing off the hills like thunder. Then came the armor. From the north, along the road from Noville, German tanks appeared through the mist, black shapes moving slow and deliberate, their tracks grinding over the frozen road. Behind them came infantry in white camouflage, ghost-like against the snow. The first shots from the American lines rang out, sharp and flat. Machine guns opened up, tracer rounds stitching the gray air. Mortars thumped from behind the ridges, shells bursting among the advancing troops. For hours, the battle raged around the edges of Bastogne. The snow muffled the sound of explosions, turning them into dull, concussive thuds. Visibility was poor. Men fired at shadows, at movement between trees. German panzers pushed forward, only to be met by bazooka teams hidden behind drifts or crouched in barns. Every road, every field became a killing ground. The 101st was not retreating. They were holding. By midday, the wounded began to arrive at the makeshift aid station inside a church on Rue Neuf-Gâteau. The pews had been cleared away, replaced with stretchers. Candles flickered against the stone walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Outside, medics dragged more men in on sleds made from doors and sheets of canvas. The air was filled with the mingled smells of blood, smoke, and cold stone. The weather worsened as the day went on. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The roads turned to ice, and the sky hung low and gray. German artillery pounded the town intermittently, searching for the headquarters, the fuel dumps, the artillery batteries hidden in the woods. Each explosion sent showers of snow cascading from rooftops. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying as the ground trembled above them. Through it all, the paratroopers held their lines. They had no winter gear, few blankets, and little food. Their rifles jammed from the cold, their hands cracked and bled. Yet they stayed awake, taking turns on watch, staring into the white void where enemy movement could come from anywhere. The frost clung to their eyelashes, their breath turning to ice crystals in the dim light. When night came again, it brought no relief. The temperature plunged to 20 below zero. Fires were forbidden for fear of giving away positions. The men sat in their foxholes, shivering uncontrollably, pulling their collars up against the wind. Somewhere out in the dark, the faint clanking of tank tracks echoed again, a reminder that the siege was closing in. The first day at Bastogne had ended. The 101st was surrounded, but they did not yet know it. Their supply lines were already cut, their radios beginning to fail. Snow drifted into their trenches and froze their weapons solid. Yet in the darkness, under the whispering pines and the endless snow, a quiet resolve took hold. The kind that only forms when men understand that there is no way out but through. In the coming days, the world would close around them, a white circle of fire and steel. The German soldiers advancing on Bastogne expected to find broken resistance, a shattered unit in retreat. What they would discover instead was something far different, a line of Americans who would not yield, no matter how cold, how hungry, or how hopeless the fight became. The Siege of Bastogne had begun, and in the frozen heart of the Ardennes, the legend of the 101st Airborne was about to be written, not in triumph, but in endurance. The road to Bastogne began long before the snow. In the closing months of 1944, the Allies believed the war in Europe was nearing its end. Paris had been liberated, the German army was in retreat, and the Rhine River, the final barrier to the heart of Germany, was within reach. Confidence spread through Allied headquarters. Many thought the war could be over by Christmas. But in the forests of Western Germany, another plan had been taking shape, one born of desperation, pride, and illusion. Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat, convinced that the Allies were divided. Exhausted and overconfident, He conceived a final counterstrike that would shatter their momentum and force a political settlement on his terms. Its codename was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer, 5th Panzer, and 7th Army, would punch through the weakly held Ardennes front in Belgium and Luxembourg, a region the Allies considered unsuitable for large-scale operations. Using surprise, speed, and the dense forest as cover, they would drive west toward the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and cut the Allied forces in two. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing stroke meant to reverse the tide of war. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1944, the offensive began. The quiet forest exploded with the thunder of artillery. Over 1,000 guns opened fire, shattering the calm of the Ardennes. American soldiers on the front lines, many of them inexperienced or resting units, were caught completely off guard. Within hours, German armored spearheads, Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs were rolling through the fog-shrouded woods, overrunning positions and pushing deep into Allied lines. At first, Allied headquarters dismissed the reports as isolated attacks. But by midday, it was clear this was no small skirmish. The German army had launched a massive counteroffensive, the largest they had attempted since 1941. Confusion spread across the front. Communications were cut. Roads were jammed with retreating columns. The thin American lines buckled under the pressure. By December 18th, entire regiments had been forced back or destroyed. The town of St. Vith was under threat, and the road network of the Ardennes, narrow, twisting, and easily blocked, became a nightmare of frozen traffic and panic. In the chaos, one small Belgian town stood out on the maps of every commander on both sides, Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever held Bastogne could control the entire southern sector of the offensive. For the Germans, it was the key to keeping their advance supplied and organized. For the Americans, it was the last anchor point preventing a complete collapse of the line. When reports reached General Eisenhower's headquarters that Bastogne was threatened, he acted quickly. The only division within striking distance, rested, mobile, and capable of holding ground, was the 101st Airborne, stationed at Mourmelon. They had been enjoying what little rest the war allowed, their weapons cleaned, their spirits high, their minds already turning toward home. But the order came suddenly and without warning. Move out immediately. Destination, Bastogne. They left in the dead of night. Truck convoys wound through the narrow, icy roads of France, headlights blacked out, engines growling against the cold. Snow fell steadily, thickening as they moved north. The men of the 101st, veterans of Normandy and Holland, knew nothing except that they were being sent toward the sound of guns. By dawn, they reached the Belgian border. By the next evening, they were in Bastogne, stepping into the middle of a storm that would soon engulf them. The German advance was already closing in. To the north, units of the 2nd Panzer Division pushed toward Neuville. To the south, Panzerlehr and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division were advancing from Wiltz and Eschdorf. By the 20th, the town was nearly surrounded. The 101st Airborne, joined by fragments of the 10th Armored Division and scattered engineers, formed a rough defensive perimeter, thin, improvised, but unyielding. The Americans were badly equipped for winter warfare. They lacked proper coats, boots, and gloves. Ammunition was limited. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were running out. The snow froze everything: weapons, rations, even the blood in their bandages. Trucks bringing supplies from the rear were forced to turn back as German tanks cut the roads. The sky remained overcast, grounding Allied aircraft and preventing resupply by air. Inside the town, the civilian population huddled in basements, sharing what little food remained with the soldiers. Children watched silently as paratroopers dug in around their homes, their rifles covered with frost, faces gaunt from exhaustion. The old church on the Rue Neuf-Gâteau became both hospital and sanctuary. Wounded men lay in rows, their breath visible in the cold, the moans blending with the distant rumble of artillery. Meanwhile, German commanders believed the capture of Bastogne would be swift. They considered the defenders a mere obstacle on the road to the Meuse. Orders went out to encircle and annihilate them. On December 21st, the ring closed completely. The last road south was cut. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Inside Bastogne, General McAuliffe maintained calm. Communications with higher command were intermittent, often reduced to brief radio bursts through static. The men knew they were cut off. They also knew retreat was impossible. What they did not yet know was how completely they were alone. Outside the perimeter, the German forces tightened their grip. Their artillery rained shells into the town day and night, each explosion shaking the earth and shattering windows. Houses caught fire, illuminating the snow with an eerie orange glow before being smothered by smoke. The roads were clogged with wreckage, burned trucks, shattered guns, the frozen bodies of men and horses. The forest echoed with the sound of engines and the distant clank of tank treads. The cold became the enemy as much as the Germans. Frostbite spread through the ranks. Soldiers wrapped their feet in torn parachutes and rags. Their breath froze on their scarves. The snow was both shield and prison, concealing foxholes but trapping the wounded. Supplies dwindled further. Men shared single cans of rations among 3 or 4. When ammunition began to run low, patrols crawled through the snow at night to scavenge from fallen comrades. And yet, despite everything, morale held. They had been trained to fight under worse odds, at Normandy, at Corentin, at Eindhoven. They trusted their officers, their brothers, their discipline. They knew the weight of the uniform they wore. Bastogne was more than a town now. It was a line drawn in the snow between defeat and endurance. For the German soldiers advancing on the perimeter, the resistance was baffling. Every assault met fierce, organized defense. The Americans fought from behind snowbanks, from cellars, from shattered barns. Their fire was precise, their resolve unshaken. Prisoners captured in small raids spoke of cold, hunger, and exhaustion, but never of surrender. Then, on December 22nd, the German commander, Lieutenant General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, sent a written demand for surrender. His message was formal, even courteous, promising honorable treatment for the Americans if they laid down their arms. It was delivered under a white flag through the lines, carried by 2 German officers in long winter coats. Inside the Bastogne headquarters, the note was handed to General McAuliffe. He read it once, then again, and allowed himself a rare, tired smile. His reply would become legend. It was brief, direct, and entirely in keeping with the spirit of the men who held the town. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the fields where men waited in silence, rifles ready, knowing that the next day would bring new attacks. The enemy was all around them. The weather was worsening. Supplies were nearly gone. But the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded, outnumbered, frozen to the bone, stood firm. They were not fighting for ground anymore. They were fighting for the idea that even when everything collapses, something can still endure. And that defiance, quiet, bitter, absolute, would soon echo across the entire front by the dawn of December 23rd. The Siege of Bastogne had entered its 4th day. The perimeter now resembled a ring of frozen wounds, thin lines of defense carved into snow, held together by exhaustion and stubbornness. Each company knew its sector, its foxholes spaced unevenly along the woods and roads that framed the town. The men had stopped counting hours or days. There was only the next attack, the next shell, the next breath in the cold. The German army had expected Bastogne to fall quickly. It had not. Each failed assault hardened their resolve to crush it completely. New artillery batteries were brought up, firing from forest clearings and ridgelines just beyond American range. Mortars whispered across the sky before breaking open over the town. Shells burst in the streets, scattering snow and debris into the air like shrapnel made of winter itself. Inside Bastogne, the civilians had retreated underground. Entire families huddled in cellars beneath the stone houses. They listened to the distant rhythm of guns like an approaching heartbeat. Above them, paratroopers moved through the ruins, reinforcing walls, laying mines, setting ambushes. They moved without words, communicating through gestures and glances. Silence had become their ally. The wounded filled the church. Rows of stretchers extended from the altar to the door. The air was heavy with smoke from candles and the metallic scent of blood. The pews had been taken apart to make splints. Morphine was nearly gone. Blankets were soaked through with freezing condensation. Outside, medics dragged the injured through the snow on makeshift sleds, their boots leaving dark trails behind them. At night, the temperature dropped even lower. The cold gnawed at the men's bones. They scraped frost from their rifles, used rags to cover their hands, and sat shoulder to shoulder for warmth in holes that filled slowly with snow. When rations ran out, they chewed on frozen chocolate or pieces of hard bread too solid to bite. Their helmets collected ice from their own breath. The war had slowed to a crawl, a brutal, grinding stillness between bursts of violence. On the 23rd, the Germans struck again. The attack came from the north, through the village of Neuville, where the snow hid entire companies until they were almost at the line. The first shells fell just before dawn, exploding in the treetops. Branches fell like spears into the foxholes below. Then came the tanks, tigers and panthers, their engines muffled by the snow, their silhouettes barely visible through the fog. They rolled forward, firing blindly into the smoke. The 101st answered with everything they had. Anti-tank guns positioned along the road spat fire. Bazooka teams waited in ditches, emerging at the last moment to strike. The air was filled with the deafening clash of steel and fire. One German tank burst into flames, its crew spilling out into the snow, silhouettes against the blaze. Another kept coming, grinding forward even as its treads burned. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with twisted metal and motionless figures, both German and American. The snow turned gray with ash and frozen blood. The men in the foxholes reloaded silently, staring into the mist for the next wave. The next day brought more of the same. The Germans shifted their attack south, probing for weakness near Marvy and Neff. The town shook under the constant barrage. Ammunition was now so scarce that each round was counted, each shot deliberate. Medics reused bandages, washing them in melted snow. The radio operators strained to catch fragments of messages through static, their fingers numb on the keys. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the shelling reached its peak. For 16 hours, German artillery pounded Bastogne. The sky turned black with smoke. The snow glowed orange in the night from burning buildings. Every explosion tore through the frozen air like a hammer on glass. Civilians prayed in the basements. Soldiers held their helmets tight, eyes fixed on the trembling earth. And yet, the line did not break. The paratroopers held, even as the bombardment shook the foundations of the town. Even as the wounded moaned and the dead froze where they fell, the defense remained intact. The Germans had thrown in tanks, artillery, and infantry, but the 101st would not yield an inch. That night, as the guns fell silent for the first time in days, the men sat in the dark. Some lit small candles taken from the church. The faint glow flickered against their faces, hollow with exhaustion. Somewhere in the distance, a lone trumpet played a few bars of a Christmas hymn. It was impossible to tell which side it came from. For a brief moment, the war seemed to pause, not out of mercy, but fatigue. By morning, the snow began to fall again, heavier than before. The landscape turned white once more, covering the scars of the night. But beneath the snow, nothing had changed. The siege continued, relentless and absolute. From the German perspective, frustration grew. Their reports described the Americans as entrenched like iron. Every attack cost the men and time they could not afford. Fuel shortages worsened, and the weather that had protected them from Allied air power was beginning to clear. To the west, their timetable was slipping. The drive toward the Meuse was stalling. Bastogne, once considered a minor objective, had become a bleeding wound in the center of the offensive. To the men of the 101st, none of this mattered. They had no sense of a larger battle, no maps of the overall front. All they knew was what they could see: the snow, the wreckage, and the line they were ordered to hold. Each man's world had shrunk to the few hundred yards of frozen ground around his foxhole. Their war was measured in the distance to the nearest tree line, the time between barges, the number of rounds left in their magazines. Then, on December 25th, the weather finally broke. The sky cleared, revealing a pale, brilliant blue for the first time in a week. The sound of engines filled the air, not German tanks this time, but aircraft. American C-47s appeared over the town, flying low, their bellies opening to release parachutes. Crates tumbled from the sky, trailing silk, ammunition, food, medicine. The men cheered weakly as the supplies landed across the snow. For the first time since the siege began, hope returned. The next day, German forces made one last major effort to take Bastogne before reinforcements could arrive. They attacked from the east, concentrating their armor and artillery on the road from Ardennes. The bombardment began before dawn and lasted for hours. Then came the infantry, advancing through the fog in waves. The paratroopers met them with disciplined, concentrated fire. Machine guns rattled from the foxholes. Mortars fell among the attackers. The snow was churned into mud and blood. In some sectors, the fighting reached hand-to-hand range. Men fought among shattered trees, bayonets flashing in the gray light. The Germans pressed hard, but every time they gained ground, a counterattack threw them back. The 101st would not bend. They had no more room to retreat. The town behind them was filled with the wounded and the dying. There was nowhere to go but forward. By nightfall, the German attack faltered. The fields were littered with burning tanks and motionless bodies. The snow began to fall again, covering everything, erasing for a few hours the evidence of what had just happened. The Americans dug in deeper, their breath rising like smoke in the cold. The siege had reached its breaking point, but so had the offensive that had created it. Unknown to the men inside Bastogne, General Patton's Third Army was already on the move from the south, racing through the snow to relieve the town. The roads were choked with ice and wreckage, but they kept advancing, tanks, trucks, and half-tracks pushing north through the storm. Inside the frozen circle, the 101st endured one more night under fire. They were surrounded, starved, frozen, and half-mad with fatigue. But the line still held. The Germans could not understand it. No one could. For 6 days, the town had defied every expectation. For 6 days, it had stood as a pocket of resistance in the middle of a vast, collapsing front. And for 6 days, the men of the 101st Airborne had proved that even when trapped and forgotten, surrounded by an enemy that believed them finished, courage could outlast the cold. December 26th, 1944. The 7th day of the siege. Dawn broke gray and bitter, the air sharp as glass. The fields around Bastogne lay silent beneath a fresh layer of snow, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath that stillness, the ground was scarred, cratered, and littered with the remnants of a battle that had not yet ended. Frozen rifles, twisted helmets, tracks from tanks long burned out, all half buried by the snow, as if the earth itself were trying to erase the memory. The men of the 101st Airborne had survived another night. Their foxholes were little more than shallow graves now, filled with ice and the smell of damp wool. Some men had stopped feeling the cold altogether, their skin raw and colorless, their faces hollow. The aid stations overflowed. The wounded lay wrapped in blankets that froze stiff before morning. Morphine was gone. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Still, they endured. The shelling began again just after sunrise. German guns on the ridgelines east of the town fired in steady rhythm, each explosion sending columns of snow and smoke into the air. The barrage lasted nearly 2 hours. When it stopped, the air was filled with drifting white powder that sparkled faintly in the cold light. Out of that haze came the tanks, dark, angular shapes moving through the fog. The final assault on Bastogne had begun. They came from the southeast, down the road from Marvy, supported by infantry in white camouflage. The snow muted the sound of their engines until they were almost at the line. Then the first Sherman opened fire, the crack of its gun echoing through the forest. The shell hit the lead Panther squarely in the glassy plate, bouncing off but leaving a black scar across the armor. The Panther replied, its round tearing through a farmhouse that exploded into splinters. The paratroopers waited until the German infantry was close enough to see their breath in the air, then opened fire. Rifles, machine guns, mortars. The forest erupted in flame and noise. Tracer fire cut through the snow like red needles. The ground shook beneath the recoil of tank guns. Men fell, vanished, rose again through the haze. The Germans advanced in short bursts, dropping to the ground, firing, then crawling forward. The Americans answered shot for shot, refusing to give an inch. In the field south of town, one Tiger tank broke through the American line. Its gun fired point-blank into a position, blowing men and snow into the air. Before it could fire again, a bazooka team emerged from a shell hole, their faces white with frost. The rocket struck the tank's flank. The explosion echoed across the valley, a bloom of fire against the gray morning. The Tiger burned where it stood, black smoke curling into the snow-laden sky. All along the perimeter, the same story repeated. German attacks surged, faltered, then broke. The defenders, frozen and starved, fought with the precision of men who had nothing left to lose. Every foxhole became a fortress, every patch of snow a line to defend. They had no reinforcements, no escape, no illusion of relief, only the instinct to endure. As the battle raged, the skies began to change. The clouds that had blanketed the Ardennes for days started to break apart, revealing a cold, hard blue above. Then came the sound, distant at first, growing steadily louder. Aircraft engines. The men looked up to see waves of C-47s approaching from the west, their bellies opening to release parachutes once again. Supplies drifted down over the town, food, ammunition, medical kits, fuel. The white parachutes floated among the falling snow like fragile hope descending from heaven. Not far behind them came another sound, sharper, faster. Fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts streaked across the sky, their wings flashing in the light. They dove low over the tree line, releasing rockets that streaked into German positions on the ridges. Explosions rippled through the forest. The artillery that had tormented Bastogne for a week suddenly fell silent. The men in the foxholes cheered weakly, their voices hoarse from the cold. For the first time in days, the sky belonged to them again. But the battle was not over. The German attack pressed on, desperate to break through before American reinforcements could arrive. Along the southern road, the fighting reached a fever pitch. Paratroopers and tank crews fought side by side, exchanging fire at point-blank range. The snow churned into gray slush beneath their boots. The air was thick with smoke and powder. In some places, the lines were so close that men could hear the enemy shouting orders through the wind. The Germans threw everything they had left into the assault, their last tanks, their last ammunition, their last illusion of victory. But the perimeter held. Every road leading into Bastogne was a trap. Every approach had been zeroed in by mortars and anti-tank guns. when one German column tried to advance through the woods near Assenois. The Americans let them come halfway before unleashing a storm of fire that shattered the formation. Flames rose from the trees, black smoke mixing with snowflakes. Then, in the late afternoon, a new sound came from the south, deep, steady, and growing louder. Engines, dozens of them. Through the haze of battle, the first American tanks appeared, moving up the road from Neufchâtel. Sherman's half-tracks and trucks bearing the white star of Patton's Third Army. The relief column had arrived. The men inside Bastogne watched as the armored column pushed through the German lines, guns blazing. The defenders rose from their foxholes, waving frantically through the smoke. Some wept, others simply stared, too numb to react. The siege, 7 days of encirclement, starvation, and relentless attack, was broken. By nightfall, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division had entered the town. Their engines idled in the square, the metal still hot from battle. Soldiers from both units met in the middle of the ruins, men covered in ice, soot, and blood, shaking hands without words. The sound of distant gunfire faded into the dark. The snow fell softly again, covering the wreckage, the shell craters, the burned-out vehicles. But the fighting did not end completely. The Germans launched sporadic attacks over the next several days, hoping to close the gap again. Each was repelled with the same grim determination. The defenders, now reinforced, pushed outward, reclaiming the woods and fields inch by inch. The Siege of Bastogne was over, but the battle for the Ardennes still raged across Belgium and Luxembourg. When the last shots faded, the scale of what had been endured became clear. The town was a ruin, its streets buried under debris, its church roof collapsed, its people emerging from cellars dazed and hollow-eyed. Hundreds of American soldiers lay frozen in the snow, their bodies stiff, rifles still in their hands. The wounded filled every building that still stood. And yet, amid that devastation, the flags still flew from the headquarters building, torn, smoke-stained, but unfallen. For the German soldiers who had fought at Bastogne, the experience left a deep mark. They had expected a swift victory. Instead, they found an enemy who refused to yield, who fought on through hunger, frost, and hopeless odds. They began to call Bastogne the little Stalingrad of the West. The Ardennes offensive would continue for several more weeks, but the failure to take Bastogne crippled its momentum. The weather cleared, the skies filled with Allied aircraft, and the German dream of reaching Antwerp collapsed. The bulge in the front line began to shrink. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the relief brought little comfort. They had held the town, yes, but at a terrible cost. Many were too weak to stand. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and faces. The dead were buried under the snow or left where they fell until the ground could be thawed. Yet when reporters later asked them about Bastogne, they spoke not of suffering, but of duty, of the simple, brutal act of holding when holding seemed impossible. In the official reports, the engagement was reduced to maps, numbers, and coordinates. Enemy attacks repelled. Casualties heavy. Town secured. But for those who had been there, Bastogne was not a victory. It was a testament. It was proof that courage could exist even in the absence of hope. When night fell on December 26th, the fires burned low across the valley. The air was still and bitterly cold. The stars, hidden for a week, returned, sharp and unblinking above the black forest. The men of the 101st huddled in their foxholes once more, not celebrating, but resting, their faces turned upward toward the endless winter sky. They had not won a battle in the traditional sense. They had simply refused to lose. When the sun rose over Bastogne on December 27, 1944, the town no longer resembled a battlefield. It looked like something older and more permanent, a scar carved into the face of Europe. Smoke still curled upward from burned houses. The snow was gray with ash. The roads were clogged with wreckage. the outlines of destroyed vehicles half buried beneath drifts of ice. The air smelled of gunpowder and frozen mud. There was no sound but the wind and the occasional distant crack of rifles along the retreating German lines. The siege had ended, but the war went on. The men of the 101st Airborne did not celebrate. They were too cold, too hungry, too tired. They sat in the same holes they had dug a week earlier, staring out across fields littered with the debris of survival. Empty ammo crates, broken helmets, shattered rifles. The snow covered everything with a deceptive calm. Beneath that thin white layer lay the frozen remains of hundreds who had not lived to see the relief. In the town square, the relief columns of Patton's Third Army continued to arrive: trucks, tanks, medical convoys. They brought food, blankets, ammunition, and cigarettes. To the exhausted defenders, the sight was almost surreal. For days, their world had shrunk to the sound of shells and the bitter taste of frost. Now there were headlights in the streets, voices calling out orders, and men shaking hands like ghosts reuniting in some dream. The civilians began to emerge from their basements. Pale, silent, they moved through the ruins of their homes, carrying what little remained: a photograph, a blanket, a loaf of frozen bread. Children followed the soldiers through the streets, wide-eyed, too stunned to speak. The old church was now little more than a shell. Its roof collapsed, its stained glass windows shattered. Inside, the wounded were being carried out on stretchers, one after another. The snow outside the doorway was red. By the end of the day, Patton's columns had secured the approaches south of Bastogne. The ring that had strangled the town for 7 days was gone. The German divisions, bleeding from the failed offensive, were in retreat. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the momentum had shifted. The Ardennes, once seen as Germany's last hope, had become a graveyard of that hope instead. For the men of the 101st, the order was simple: hold Bastogne. And they had. Against the odds, against logic, against the very limits of human endurance, they had held. Historians would later call it a turning point, a symbol of American resilience in Europe. But for those who were there, the memory was quieter, colder, heavier. The survivors were scattered among the ruins. They walked the fields, searching for the bodies of friends they had last seen alive only days before. They dug through the snow with their bare hands, uncovering helmets and dog tags, laying the dead in neat rows that the wind quickly covered again. The chaplains moved from one body to the next, their breath freezing as they spoke brief words over each. There was no ceremony, no music, only silence and the distant hum of engines. In the days that followed, the weather finally broke. The clouds lifted, revealing a pale winter sun over the Ardennes. The snow melted slowly, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Whole villages were flattened. The forests were splintered by shell fire. Roads were lined with burned-out vehicles, their metal twisted into grotesque shapes. Birds returned to the sky, circling above what had once been killing fields. Military photographers arrived, documenting the aftermath. Their cameras captured the faces of men who looked far older than their years, faces lined with frostbite and fatigue, eyes staring into some distance only they could see. The photos would appear in newspapers weeks later, accompanied by words like heroic and unbreakable. But those words never seemed to match what the men remembered, because Bastogne was not about victory. It was about endurance, the kind that does not feel noble or cinematic in the moment, but raw, necessary, and unending. It was about men freezing in holes, fighting hunger and fear with the same stubbornness they used to fight the enemy. It was about a small patch of earth in Belgium that came to represent something far larger: the refusal to give up, even when reason demanded surrender. The Germans would never again mount a major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge had consumed the last of their reserves, their fuel, their armor, their faith in the possibility of turning the tide. What had begun as Hitler's desperate gamble ended as a catastrophe. And in the center of that collapse, Bastogne stood as both wound and warning. Weeks later, when the snow had finally melted, replacements arrived to relieve the 101st. They found the foxholes still there, frozen in place, filled with the remnants of what had been endured. Empty ration tins, broken rifles, cigarette butts pressed into the ice. The men who had held the line were gone now, sent back for rest, though rest was a word that no longer meant much. They carried Bastogne with them wherever they went after. Some would fight on to the end of the war, across the Rhine, into Germany, through towns reduced to rubble. Others would go home, carrying stories they would rarely tell. And some would never return at all, their names carved into stone long after the world moved on. But history remembered them. In the years that followed, Bastogne became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the quiet kind of heroism that exists not in triumph, but in endurance. The fields that once echoed with gunfire are quiet now. The forests have grown back, covering the craters and trenches. Tourists walk the streets, unaware that every stone beneath their feet once trembled with artillery fire. In the center of town stands a memorial shaped like a star, each arm bearing the name of a state whose sons fought there. The inscription is simple, almost austere. They held the line. And that is the truth of Bastogne. Not that they conquered or advanced or won, but that they held. Through hunger, through cold, through isolation, they held. The snow that fell over Bastogne that December has long since melted. The wrecks have rusted away, the scars softened by time. But the story endures, a story of men surrounded, starving, freezing, yet unbroken. A story that lives not in monuments, but in the idea that even in the darkest winter, there is something within the human spirit that refuses to yield. Because Bastogne was not just a battle. It was a moment when ordinary men met impossible odds and, without fanfare or glory, endured them. When the wind blows through the Ardennes today, it moves quietly through the trees that grew from the soil once churned by tanks. It carries no echoes of artillery, only the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of memory. And somewhere beneath that silence lies the truth that history cannot bury. That in the winter of 1944, in a small Belgian town surrounded by the enemy and swallowed by snow, the 101st Airborne Division did not surrender. They simply endured.